Natasha, we had a wonderful time talking in Cambridge. One of the most striking things was that the young women were asking questions that you might have asked back in 1980.
Yes, that's interesting, isn't it? And I think it alerts us to something about feminism, which is that none of the struggles that we started 10 years ago, 20 years ago, or even the struggles that Mary Wollstonecraft or Alain de Gouges started 200 years ago have really been finished. We're all still on this journey. But I think that isn't to say that there hasn't been progress. I just think that when you come back to some of those key issues around things like how does the personal and political intersect, because I think that's what a lot of the young women very much wanted to talk about. How do my personal day-to-day choices intersect with that bigger political picture that we're talking about? I think these bigger, we're all still trying to work that out. We're all still on that journey.
So there are two parts to that. One part of that might be what's happening at a social level in our communities, and the other might be what's happening in the family or in personal relations. And do you think those two things are moving at quite different paces?
No, I think they're moving along together. And I think that's the brilliant, isn't that the brilliant insight, particularly of second wave feminism, the personal is the political, that these things are absolutely mingled. And I think very often in feminism you get people saying, come on, let's talk about the big things, let's talk about economic inequality or political inequality, rather than let's talk about cultural sexism and some of the things that might feel a bit trivial around harassment or around the way women are represented in our culture. But in fact I think it is all interlinked, because if you're living in a culture where day to day women are feeling very objectified and quite disempowered, that's also a culture where they're going to find it difficult to really take their place in the public arena.
And do you think there are families now where you've had 3 generations of feminists? And do you think that's evident? We can see those people working in different ways? Yeah. Or do you think every generation just makes its own feminism?
Well, what I think is wonderful is seeing now how young men are really taking on feminism so much more. I think it's become so much more taken for granted that men are going to be involved in childcare. They're just really, I think, taking so much more of a role in the home than they used to. And we've just got to see more of that. I think we've got to really build on that. Because, we were saying 10 or 20 years ago, it's great that women are moving into the workplace. And this is a revolution that's really beginning now, but it's not going to be complete until men step up in the home, because you can't have the one without the other, because somebody has to be doing that unpaid work in the home. We can't all be out succeeding in the workplace.
It always sounds to me so rational and reasonable. Why are people terrified of the word feminism? And here, I don't mean men. Often I have students who turn to me and say, I'm not a feminist. I say, well, what are you? A misogynist? Is that the opposite?
Exactly.
What is it?
I don't understand it when women say I'm not a feminist, and I always want to say, what? You mean you actually don't really want the vote? You don't really want to be paid, equally for work of equal value? If you experience sexual violence, you don't really want support in a rape crisis centre. You don't really want the police to take you seriously. Is that what you mean? And no, but that isn't what people mean. I think the problem is that feminism is still so misrepresented, and often even our achievements are sort of twisted against us, So I think there is still, even though there are these, I think it's great to see people standing up in the mainstream, Hollywood actresses, popular singers, and saying, yeah, I'm a feminist, I care about women's rights. Despite that, you're absolutely right. I think there's still a real fear from people about feminism. And I think particularly, young women, I think, are still scared of this taint of being thought anti-men or anti-sex. And I think it's really important that we do break through that and tell the positive story about feminism and how feminism does include men, as well as the difficult stories that feminism tells us about violence against women and about injustice.
In one way, you might say that the gay movement has been more successful than feminism, in that it's changed the law, there's much more open gayness in TV, in a way that isn't just stereotyping or stupid. And despite the fact we know that there's still awful violence on the street, and in many countries around the world it's still extraordinarily hard to be gay, nonetheless, in our Western community, you might say that's been a real triumph of the last 30 years. Why hasn't feminism been so successful?
There have been real triumphs of feminism. I mean, just think what it would have been like in Cambridge, 150 years ago. Just think of the things that we completely take for granted about women's entry into higher education, which was fought for so bitterly with such hatred. Women's entry into the professions, each one, law, medicine, how the barriers were raised, and women really had to push them down. The struggle for suffrage, of course, and also the struggle for things like rights in marriage. I think, again, we often take for granted or trivialise that fight for women to own their own property after marriage, or women's safety in marriage. It wasn't that long ago since rape in marriage was not even a crime. So I think, I think there is a danger in looking really hard at everything that needs to be done, the negatives, the problems. We've also sometimes got to open up spaces where we can be positive and say, look at some of the changes that have been created. Or else I think we run the danger of just being a bit exhausted and a bit miserable all the time. And you're not going to build a movement for further change if you're all sitting around sort of saying, actually, ladies, it's dreadful out there. You've got to have some sense of potential, haven't you?
So if you were put on the spot and said, are you an optimist? You'd say, yeah, go for it.
I'm not an optimist necessarily, but I am hopeful. I am hopeful because I think sometimes change can take you by surprise. And I've been surprised over the last 5 years. When I published my book, Living Dolls, I felt no one was talking about cultural sexism. And that conversation has totally changed. And even in the last year, I'm working on this campaign against the detention of women in Yarlswood. And a year ago, we couldn't get politicians really to talk to us. Just recently there was a debate in Parliament where the Shadow Home Secretary said this is state-sanctioned abuse of women, and politicians of all parties were joining in. Okay, that isn't change yet. But when you see things that you didn't really think were going to happening, you think, well, maybe something else is going to happen. So I think that's something about always, if you're activist, if you're involved in change, it's hard to see the wood for the trees. You're inside the tent, you're not outside it looking in, and it's hard to see the shape of where you are. But if you look back over the last year or over the last 5 years and try and think of some markers, you do see the change. I mean, just look, Simon, at the change in International Women's Day. I remember when International Women's Day was something that nobody was talking about. People weren't really aware of it. Now you've got festivals in London, Cambridge, lots of other cities. You've got celebrations, marches going on all over the place, and it's just become something that people are talking about. What does it mean? What does it stand for? No,
it must be said that if good people don't work together, there's no hope.
Yes,
which good people do.
Yes, which is why in these talks, that I've been privileged to give at Cambridge this week, I keep returning to this theme of solidarity. It feels that however far I get away from it, something keeps drawing me back, because I think, why is it that we've kind of stopped talking about it? It was very central to feminism, second wave feminism. Is there a way of reviving that discussion of solidarity, sisterhood, or maybe also brotherhood, siblinghood, in a way that doesn't feel as though we're trying to say, we're all the same, we're all going to work in the same direction, we're all going to go forward step by step, but just kind of sharing our differences, but recognising...
It has to be a sophisticated sense of collaboration where those differences aren't ignored, but where they don't become crippling.
Absolutely, yes.